Welcome everyone. Today I'll be going over armor and weapon enchantment choices for PvP. An important thing to know about armor enchantments in particular is this is one of the highest priority defensive items to get in PvP. If your armor enchantment is not one of the ones that is good in PvP, you will be made of paper. You'll die too much. If you look at the little block of text in the corner there, I've provided a list of all the best armor and weapon enchantments for PvP, and what rank they need to be minimum for them to be good. As for what happened to the original version of this video, I took it down. It was too long and I sounded like I was about to keel over and die when I made it, so I decided to go ahead and redo it, while I still had the text blocks ready to go. Now to show you these enchantments individually, here is Elven Battle enchantment. Elven Battle is mainly good for the CC resistance it provides you. The defensive applications of this enchantment are what people tend to think about, but this same CC resistance passively helps you do more damage because it frees you up to be able to attack more and move around more. The stamina regen is nice too, but this isn't usually why you pick it. This is a lot of stamina regen though, so enough to bring your stamina regen in PvP out of the negative range and then some. Elven Battle is favored by lightweight builds that are damage oriented, such as Rogue and Ranger. Some tanky high-end builds on other classes can also use this. Now some classes will find that they need to be tankier than what this enchantment is able to provide you. If you happen to be one of those other classes, you probably want negation. Pulling up negation here. So negation is what most of the other classes favor right now. This enchantment makes you a lot tankier and it comes with a small self-heal as well. But on the downside, you will be more vulnerable to getting CC'd for long periods of time, so keep that in mind. This enchantment on paper can still passively increase your damage output by making you tanky enough to be able to stay out in the open longer and attack more frequently. This is a feature of tanky builds in general. In practice though, you will get tangled up in CCs quite a lot, and I'd still say Elven Battle is still superior for damage output. Now let's say you are on a budget and can't afford an R12 of the other armor enchantments. If this describes you, there is another option. Soulforged is an outlier that is good at any rank. The important part is the revive for this enchantment. Nothing else on it matters. You can see on the screen here how cheap Soulforged is. Soulforged favors kinda hit and run playstyles and players that can heal themselves for a ridiculous amount faster than they are getting killed. It's kinda OP on both rogues and healers for this reason. The downside to this enchantment is you'll be really squishy with this on. It can be OP on any class if their team has a healer on it, because when that player is revived by their Soulforged, the healer will heal them to full. Soulforged, while somewhat OP, is only good up to a point. If you are on a near-maxed high-end build, Soulforged wouldn't be biz anymore for you, on Rogue at least. Probably the same is true of Healer. The reason being is at a competitive level, you want to be sturdier so you are better equipped to defend your teammates while on the move. For my PvP events, this enchantment is actually on the ban list. It's not good for PvP's health for there to be a lot of Soulforged enchantments active. It is really annoying. And it also makes manual matchmaking significantly harder. Like if you've got two of the same class and one has this enchantment and the other doesn't, that makes the matchmaking for that much more difficult for those enchantments to mismatch like that. That said, this is a soft ban instead of a hard ban, meaning I do allow it in some circumstances. If you can't afford an R12 of a different PvP enchantment, I do allow people to run Soulforged. If you have gotten to the point where you can afford to run an R12, you shouldn't be running it. You shouldn't be running this anymore. You don't need it anymore. Okay, moving on to weapon enchantments. Bilethorn is one of the biz damage. Oh, let me move it over here for you. Bilethorn is one of the best in slot damage oriented enchantments. It helps you out with your consistent damage output and finishing people at low HP off. The DOT from it frequently makes or breaks whether or not you kill someone. This enchantment is favored by squishy DPS classes like Rogue and Ranger. Really high-end near max builds on some of the other classes can also afford to run this. On Rogue, this enchantment is my top recommendation for maximum effectiveness at winning matches. On Ranger, this enchantment is the second best option. More on that later. There is another more niche enchantment, another more niche damage-oriented enchantment, and that would be Bronzewood. Bronzewood is really strong when it's active, but it's only going to be active around 50% of the time, and it requires an encounter power to proc. This enchantment's damage buff can be used by your whole team, so historically Bronzewood was really good on initiator classes like Fighter in tournament settings. You want to use it on tighter packed PvP maps ideally. Stardock is honestly too spread out. This enchantment is best in slot for Ranger right now. Like, this is what the recent Ranger builds, like the ones Razorleaf runs, uses. It's also one of the best in slot options for Bard if they're not using the Drow race. Like, anything that's not the Drow race, you would run this enchantment on a Bard. The timing of this enchantment lines up well with Whisper Knife Rogue rotations, which made it really good on Rogue back in mod 19. I wasn't impressed with it in later mods though, last time I tried it. On paper it's basically a better Vorpal enchantment, and it kind of feels a bit more like item level, to be honest. Like, the damage bonus from item level is kind of similar as far as how that plays out. Moving on to Holy Avenger. Holy Avenger is best in slot for tanky builds and is a very beginner-friendly enchantment. This enchantment is a really strong self-heal when combined with other self-heals. This enchantment is almost always paired up with a negation, so if your build runs negation, probably you should be running this with it. The sorts of classes that tend to run Holy Avenger are things like Wizard, Fighter, Cleric, etc. It's more things than that. Well, more on that later. Your damage can feel a bit blunt with this enchantment on, so if you're looking to play a meta setup has really potent feeling DPS and you are experienced, you may want to consider a damage-oriented enchantment instead at that point. Moving on to Vorpal. Vorpal is an enchantment that a lot of players own. It is not best in slot for anything really, but it is a solid option on damage-oriented builds if you don't have something nicer like Bilethorn on hand. Vorpal feels really sturdy and can be close to Biz on a high item level rogue. Vorpal favors high item level builds because they tend to have more trouble holding on to high stats. Let me pull up Frost Enchantment for you. Frost Enchantment is one of the best in slot options for Bard. It needs to be combined with the Drow race for that to be the case though. Frost is also good on Rogue, though Vorpal is probably a little bit more valuable on us. It's hard to say for sure, both worked well last time I used them. That slow can be really helpful too. It's not as strong as you'd think it would be. It feels more more subtle, but it is stronger than the one for Bilethorn is. Moving on to the experimental weapon and armor enchantments. You can see the text on the screen there just changed. The enchantments you see on that list aren't best in slot for anything, and running them will make you too squishy. But they can be a fun option for you if you aren't trying to compete and just want something different. Fireburst is an enchantment you often see people trying out in PvE these days. Let me pull that up for you. Give me a sec. Fire and Burst is an enchantment you often see people trying out in PvE these days. It significantly increases your damage output, and it does come with some defensive benefits. But you'll still be too fragile with this on. Negation is still stronger than it. The next one I want to show you guys is Blood Theft. Now, it's been a long time since I've tested Blood Theft. It was a decent enchantment, but again, you are too fragile with it on. Its heal wasn't quite consistent enough to make it worth it, but it could be a really big heal when it does proc. Now, there's another enchantment that I'm not able to show you guys, and that's Loam Weave. I'm not able to show you Loam Weave because there aren't many on the auction house right now. Actually, there aren't any on the auction house right now. I did test it somewhat recently on preview, but it was like having a slightly better Tenebrous enchantment on. The damage procs were nice, but it doesn't bring anything else to the table, so you'll be made of paper with this on. For weapon enchantments, pretty much the only one that was noteworthy was Lightning. It's been ages since I last tested Lightning, but back in the day it could be used to make anti-rogue builds, in particular anti-Whisper Knife builds. What I'm not sure of is if the Lightning Arc still hits stealth targets. If it does still, then you could just hit enemies nearby a stealthed rogue to chip away at their stealth gauge and make them run out of stealth faster. Lightning does decent damage, but it is still weaker than Bilethorn in PvP. As you can see, I changed the text on the side of the screen again. Those are enchantments you shouldn't run in PvP. The bad enchantments. Shadowclad here. Shadowclad used to be the one enchantment to rule them all in PvP not too long ago. This changed in early Module 20. Shadowclad makes you deflect a lot, and you don't want to deflect in PvP. The reason being is if your opponent's accuracy is higher than your deflect severity is, those two things don't cancel each other out. You'll take extra damage when you deflect instead. This enchantment is particularly bad against Ranger and Fighter. These classes have accuracy 40. They usually have accuracy in the 70% through 90% range, so you are going to be in for a world of pain trying to run this against them. Now, if your class has deflect severity 40 and you ran a tanky build with a Foehammer's Favor elixir, Shadowclad might be decent, but it still wouldn't be best in slot. for most classes, a Shadowclad is one of the worst things you could possibly pick to run. Now, recently, I've been seeing a common mistake. Recently, I've been seeing a lot of people try to run their PvE Bark Shield enchantments in PvP. This is also a bad enchantment in PvP. You will die too fast with this enchantment on. If you have a Bark Shield on, switch it for literally anything else that is good in PvP. I recommend buying a Soulforged rank 8, even that would be better than a rank 14 Bark Shield is. As you can see, the text on the screen changed again. That is the list of enchantments I recommend for each class. You could pause the screen and read here if you want. I'll also go each of them in more detail. So, the enchantment recommendation for Rogue is Elven Battle and Bile Thorn. Now, I think I've explained that a little bit before, but to go into more detail, this is like the meta setup for a rogue. Like, this is how you max out your effectiveness at winning games, is to run the Elven Battle with the Bile Thorn. Now, we can run quite a few other things for less optimal setups. Like, Vorpal Enchantment is good on the high item level builds on Rogue, as I mentioned. It's very sturdy. And you also could run... you probably could still run Bronzewood, but again, not really optimal for an assassin. It's better on Whisper Knife. And you could actually make a rogue that runs a Holy Avenger and Negation build. Morbid does that. It's tanky, and it can be situationally good, but it's not optimal for winning matches overall. Like, you just get CC'd too much, and you're just not potent enough like that. Now, Ranger, moving on to Ranger, their recommendation is Elven Battle and either Bronzewood or Bilethorn. Now, Elven Battle is the top recommendation for Ranger. I have seen some tanky Rangers around recently, but again, like Rogue, that is not optimal. Now, in the case of the Bronzewood, as I said before, this is what Razorleaf runs. This is what the recent Mod 21 Ranger builds for PvP run. They run Bronzewood. Now, Bilethorn notably is not that far behind Bronzewood in terms of performance on a Ranger. Like, they're really close. So if you wanted to just run your Bilethorn, because it means you don't have to have an extra enchantment when going into PvP, you can use this in PvE, then just use your PvE Bilethorn in PvP. Saves you a lot of trouble. Now, if you wanted to specialize, you could pick yourself up a Bronzewood. Now, moving on to Bard. This is a weird class as far as what enchantments it needs. It was originally theory crafted to need Elven Battle enchantment. I mean, not Elven Battle. It was theory crafted to need Negation enchantment originally. But the thing about, like, when in actual practice, when people actually started playing Bard, especially Rooks, it became apparent that Bard actually still needs Elven Battle, even though this class is already very CC resistant, and it doesn't need to dodge very much. In spite of that, Elven Battle still beats Negation on Bard. Now, it is worth mentioning you would still be very fragile on Bard. Like, you'd still be kind of squishy with this on. And honestly, that can't really be helped because Bard in general is not a beginner-friendly class. Like, you want to be a somewhat experienced player already before you attempt a Bard, I'd say. Now, onto Bard's weapon enchantments. They have two options. They can roll a Drow race and run a Frost with that. and that's going to be really good because of the defense reduction. Or they could roll anything else and run that with a Bronzewood. Now, I recommend Dragonborn plus Bronzewood as the best in slot thing for Bard, but Drow plus Frost is not far behind. It might even be slightly better or worse. It's very hard to tell which of those would be better or worse without digging into the math. Now, Wizard, that class right now uses Negation and Holy Avenger pretty much always. Like, in the past, they had DPS specs that were running things like Bilethorn and Elven, but right now, Wizard needs Negation and Holy Avenger. Without those things, they will be too squishy. Now, moving on to Warlock, I'm a little bit less sure what Warlock needs right now. Negation and Holy Avenger is probably a safe bet for somebody who's starting out, but honestly, they probably run Elven Battle when they're actually at a high level. Like, a really good Warlock is probably going to pick Elven Battle. Now, the Holy Avenger, it's going to make your damage feel kind of blunt, and Warlock kind of already can have that problem when it's not completely maxed out. So if you want to build a expensive meta build Warlock with really potent DPS, you probably want to roll up a Bilethorn for that, instead of the Holy Avenger that I recommended. Now, that build, that meta Warlock should perform really well without needing to rotate like a god. Like, the tanky Warlocks, in order to really keep up, they need to rotate really well. But if you're running a meta build, you may be able to... That's going to be more potent, and you might not need to do quite as much. But if you were to have the best of both worlds, where you're rotating really well and you're playing a meta build, you're gonna kick ass. Like, you're gonna be really, really strong like that. Now, moving on to Fighter. Right now, the best thing for them, for most fighters, is to run a Negation and a Holy Avenger. Almost all fighters would be running Negation and Holy Avenger. Now, there is an exception where if you are fully maxed out, fully optimized, best of everything, you may want to consider a Bilethorn at that point. Because at that point you can afford to run a Bilethorn, and you probably are going to want some really mean DPS at that point. Not that your DPS wasn't already sufficiently mean on Fighter. Now, the other thing that would be good on Fighter for tournaments, it is Bronzewood. Now, that's kind of uncharted territory in Mod 21. I've not seen anybody attempt to run Bronzewood on their Fighter in Mod 21. But in theory, it should be just as good as ever. Like, it's good for helping out your team and taking charge in matches. Like, if you want to be the leader in a way, then you probably want the Bronzewood. Now again, you want to be on a tightly packed map if you're running Bronzewood. You don't want to be on Stardock. Now, moving on to DPS Cleric. Usually they need Negation and Holy Avenger. They're a tanky class that does not have very many CCs to push back with. Like, they can't really push back against other CC heavy classes because they don't have very many control effects themselves. So they're kind of vulnerable if they're not tanky. So they need to be tanky and they need to have some self-healing on them, or they're just going to go splat all the time. So usually you want Negation Holy Avenger for DPS Cleric. However, Frost is decent on DPS Cleric. Like, you're still going to be a little too squishy with that, but Frost actually performs reasonably well on DPS Cleric. Now, moving on to Barbarian, I'm not entirely sure what I'd recommend for them, but on PC at least, probably you want to run Negation and Holy Avenger because the most resources available to you, build-wise, are going to be people running tanky Barbarians. So if you're following a guide of any kind, it's going to be from a tanky Barbarian if you're on PC. So they would probably tell you to run Negation and Holy Avenger. Now, in the past, Barbarian was actually a little bit better if it ran a more DPS-oriented spec. but I've not seen anybody attempt this recently, except for Agus, but his build is a little too fragile, to be honest. Excellent damage, but he's made of paper. But if you were maxed out best of everything on a Barbarian, in theory you should be fine running a Bile Thorn. You'd probably still want the negation with that, but it's kind of hard to say for sure. Now, moving on to the next slide. Give me a sec. Okay, so enchantment recommendations for healers. You can see the text on the screen changed again. And the text you see on the screen right now is what I recommend for healers. I don't know as much about healer builds as I do about DPS builds, so I'm a little unsure if my weapon enchantment recommendation is right for them or not. In the past, Vorpal enchantment was for sure better than Holy Avenger. That was because Vorpal granted a lot more critical severity back then than it does today. Using Holy Avenger back then used to be the rookie mistake. And the people that actually knew what they were doing back then were running Vorpal. Now, right now, Vorpal is a lot weaker than it used to be, so probably healers run Holy Avenger now. Now, I know a lot more about healer armor enchantment choices than I do weapon. Negation and Elven Battle are pretty much equally good as each other on healer, but no matter which enchantment you pick, you'll always end up in situations where you'll find yourself lusting after the enchantment you don't have on at that moment. Neither of them is going to feel perfect on healer, but they are the best available. Soulforged, I've mentioned before, is OP on healers, but keep in mind it does make you really squishy as well. And I think that's everything, guys. That's end of the video. I'll make more soon.